Okay, my little animalcules, here we are. We are starting our video on nuclear energy. So nuclear is considered to be a type of non-renewable resource, meaning that we could run out. The amount of uranium that's available on Earth is finite. However, we have ample supplies. It's not really a concern. So nuclear is released in either two options. You can either have nuclear fission or you could have nuclear fusion. And so I'm going to try to move this. And so the most common that we want to talk about is nuclear fission. Let me see. I think I do. Hold on one second. I'm just going to make this slightly smaller here. Okay, so nuclear fission has two S's. So fission has two S's, so we're going to get out two products. So we put in uranium-235, we let it go through a reaction process, and we get out two products. We get out free neutrons, we get out barium and krypton. So for example, so you can remember that we get out two products from nuclear fission. So we take one thing, we're taking one uranium atom and we're trying to split it apart. Nuclear fusion has one S. So we're going to try to take two things and mush them together. So we're going to take two atomic nuclei and we're going to try to push them together to make them just one. And when that happens, it releases a huge amount of energy. Now, what we do on Earth is nuclear fission. That's what we know how to do. Nuclear fusion, we know how to do theoretically, but we can't, this requires high amounts of temperature, high heat, and we can't really achieve those temperatures on Earth. This is what happens on the sun. So nuclear power plants have a couple of specific parts that you need to be familiar with. This is how all electricity is made in a very similar manner. So we're going to take uranium or plutonium, and they're found in these control rods, and we make them undergo a very specific chemical reaction in which we kind of bombard them and we cause them to, the neurons or the atoms to split apart. And so you can see that here's the energy. We put that energy with water. So if you were to put energy with water in the form, you put a pot on a stove and you give it energy, you turn that stove on, what happens to the water? Well, it should start to heat up and create steam. So that's what you see here. That steam in the red things at the top are going to start to turn a generator. Or I'm sorry, a turbine. That turbine is going to spin. And here on the right-hand side, you see that it's attached to a generator. That generator is going to convert the mechanical energy from the spinning into electrical energy. It does that through a copper wire and a magnet. And so that spinning causes the electrons to start to spin and move really fast. And when they move really fast, that's actually electricity. And so you don't really need to know that, but what you do need to know is that we put the uranium under a process that produces energy. We put that energy with water. The water creates steam. The steam spins the turbine that's attached to the generator. The generator converts the mechanical energy into electrical energy. And you can see it entering the grid here. We don't waste that water. This water is very hot. If it were to be released into the environment, we would call that thermal pollution, and that's bad news bears. It would kill all the fish. It would deplete the oxygen levels in the oceans or in the rivers, wherever it was released to. That's a problem. So instead, we put them in these big cooling tanks here, and we can actually recycle it and reuse it. Fossil fuels work the same way. Instead of burning uranium, we're going to burn coal, or we're going to burn natural gas. We're going to put it with water. That creates steam. That steam spins a turbine. The turbine is attached to the generator. The generator converts mechanical energy into electrical energy. So nuclear power plants are no different. So here we have the reactor, here's the powerhouse and the cooling tower. And nuclear comes along with some very specific advantages. There's less of an immediate impact in fossil fuels, meaning that there's no mining, there's no drilling, there's no fracking. All of those things that come along with fossil fuels are awful for the environment. And so there's none of that. You do have to mine for uranium, but the process isn't nearly as bad. And there is no release of carbon dioxide in the actual production of the electricity. There is the release of carbon dioxide when you manufacture the nuclear power plant. So when you build the nuclear power plant, that releases carbon dioxide. But in actually, once the power plant is built, there is no release of carbon dioxide in producing electricity from nuclear. The disadvantage, when those fuel rods go through their process, at some point the uranium runs out and we have to deal with them. We call that radioactive waste. You still have the mining that we talked about, and they're really, really, really expensive to set up. They can offset costs. Some places rely heavily, like France, rely heavily on nuclear power plants, although they can be very expensive to initially set up. They do pay for themselves in the long run. Here we can see the different nuclear facilities. So there's one outside of Denver, there's one outside of Dallas, which is where I'm originally from. We see a lot in New England, a few in California, not so much in the Midwest. That's because we've always had plenty of coal and natural gas in the western portion of the United States. No real need for nuclear. But nuclear could absolutely be used as part of an overall plan where we're moving away from fossil fuels. It's not going to replace fossil fuels like we talked about in the last video, but it could supplement other renewables. So we could have, say, for example, solar and wind and nuclear and natural gas. We want to have all of them. There's no one size fits all solution. It's going to be piecing together small solutions to come up with an energy program for the United States. Let's talk briefly about the radioactive waste that results. The biggest thing is that if your power plant is going normally, the only kind of pollutant that you might generate would be that thermal pollution, that really hot water. Most power plants do not experience any kind of problems. The probability of a meltdown is low. The general public thinks that nuclear is not safe, but that's actually not the case. When nuclear facilities become retired, then they have to be decommissioned, and we have to deal with nuclear waste on a long term. So if the power plant is operating correctly, there is no nuclear waste. That the rods that contain the uranium are dealt with, and the biggest concern that we have is about that thermal pollution. However, there have been some big problems that have been very public. And the three major ones that you need to be familiar with are the 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, Chernobyl in Ukraine, and Fukushima in Japan. And so let me see, I'm not really sure. Okay, so these are the three accidents. So the 3 Mile Island was the first one. It occurred in 1979, and pretty much there was a nuclear meltdown. I can't really remember exactly. I think that they were maybe trying to clean it, and so something happened. There was no human casualties, no major environmental damage, but it kind of derailed the big plans for nuclear. Chernobyl happened in 1986. That's the best year. Whoop, whoop. And so this was the worst accident in history. They had some people that weren't trained properly. They were trying to shut down the nuclear reactors in order to clean them, and they basically didn't shut them down properly. And so it started to overheat and had a meltdown. Huge amounts of radiation escaped. A few people died. It spread across Europe, Ukraine. It was a very agricultural based economy, and so they weren't allowed to sell any of the foods. And so it pretty much destroyed the economy, and people had to leave. We've seen lots of long-term cancers that have resulted from that. And what we've also seen is that the organisms that live there aren't decaying. And so it's really fascinating to kind of look. You can see they have pictures, and the leaf litter is built up every winter, but it's not actually decaying and decomposing. We see some animals that have, like 8 legs instead, like spiders that might have extra legs, or insects that might have 8 legs instead of 6. And so we see some weird stuff like that. But the biggest one is the lack of decay. That's pretty fascinating. The last one we want to talk about is the Fukushima, Japan in 2011. If you recall that this was caused by a tsunami. So there was an underground earthquake. There was a giant wave that resulted, that tsunami. And so what they tried to do is they tried to shut down the plants because they knew that this big wave was coming. Pretty much they weren't able to shut it down, and they weren't able to generate enough cool water to bring down the temperature of those fuel rods. And so basically it started to overheat, and they started using ocean water, and then all that ocean water became contaminated. Huge impact on the fishing industry in the area. A few people were killed in that, I think just 2, which is still really sad. And so it's going to have an impact on the seafood industry. And kind of also, what do you do with all that water that was used to cool things down that's now contaminated? You can't release it back out into the environment. You have to store it. What are you going to do with that? Nuclear waste is currently stored at the facility. There's low level of nuclear waste that happens all the time. If you've ever had to have certain types of medical diagnostics where you have to like swallow an indicator and then they take an MRI or a CAT scan of your body, that's low level radioactive waste. It's stored at the hospital, it's taken somewhere, power plants, hospitals, those kind of thing. High level radioactive waste from spent fuel rods is dealt with in a different way, but overall they're kind of pretty similar. I'm trying to see what I have. Okay. So this low level radioactive waste can be dealt with at a hazardous waste facility. This high level radioactive waste, what we currently do is we may keep it in large pools. And so underground at the facility, there will be huge pools, like Olympic sized pools that they keep the fuel rods. They put the fuel rods in this large canister, then they put a lid on the canister and they essentially put it in a giant drum. I'm just checking to see how long I've been talking. And then they put these big drums underground in this tunnel network. You can see the ventilation shafts. You can see buildings nearby, as well as probes throughout the soil in order to check to make sure there's no contamination. We would like to store, there was a proposed site to store nuclear waste at Yucca Mountain, which is in Nevada. I guess they figured like there's nothing really out there. It's just some Vegas, some women of the night and gambling. So let's put it out there. But the senators from Nevada kind of stopped that. And so what they would do is they wanted to bury it underneath this mountain. And so that way it would be, in looking for a nuclear waste storage facility, it needs to be an area that's dry, geologically inactive. You wouldn't want there to be like an earthquake and then all of a sudden have radioactive earthquakes coming. That would be really bad. Not a lot of people near it, not a lot of biodiversity. The problem is if there were to be some type of accident, the desert is very, very fragile. It would take hundreds of years for it to recover. But we're looking for a place that's geologically inert, not a lot of people, not a lot of biodiversity, dry, and Yucca Mountain fit those kind of things. So that's a proposed site. It's never actually been taken, it's never started construction, but it's never actually been put into use. And so right now we just put things in big canisters with big drums, and then we put them in underground pools that are found throughout the United States, usually located near where the facility is. So I hope that was helpful. I think there's one more video for this unit.